The dean scared me. Sanjay and I were saying our hearts were racing with all the rules and stuff, and we're not even enrolled, so. I want to also say it was in this very room that my life changed. I was a law student at Columbia, and in this room, I took a First Amendment class with Fred W. Friendly. And my assignment was the wrong end of the argument. My assignment was to argue for the government in the Pentagon Papers case. I was the only law student in the class. And so I knew I had the unpopular end of the stick. I did my best, and at the end of the class, it turned out that Floyd Abrams, who had argued for the New York Times in front of the Supreme Court, was in the class. At the end of the class, he signaled and he said, "Fred, it's your class, you can go first, but either you offer a job as a journalist or I'm offering her a job as a lawyer." So Fred won, or I won, and I'm happy to say I did graduate from the law school, but I never looked back. So it's a pleasure to be back on campus this morning. And I have the distinct pleasure of introducing you to Dr. Sanjay Gupta, who is a real hero to me. This is a man who is a practicing neurosurgeon. When we say it ain't brain surgery, it's brain surgery. He has done, I think, with this documentary awarded the DuPont last night, something extremely important. He has told the truth, and the truth wasn't easy to get to. He has worked at CNN, as many of you know, across platforms for many years now, and I think that what we might do is interview Dr. Gupta about how this documentary came to be. There were two installments of it, and the process by which he made it. So without further ado, Dr. Sanjay Gupta. Now, he did win the DuPont last night, and he was out late partying, so, right?
A little deeper voice than
There
normal.
you go. Well, first, congratulations. It's a well-deserved award, and I hope many of you have seen it, and if you haven't, I commend it to you. It's available online. Let's start with the premise. Why a documentary on pot, on weed?
You know, we had been interested in various things in the pharmaceutical industry, including what was happening with opioid drugs overall for some time, and it was curious that with opioid drugs, these prescription medications, because of the way that they've been prescribed, the way that they've been abused, deaths due to opioids had become the #1 cause of preventable death in the United States, which is remarkable. Prescription drugs. And that was something that we had worked on for some time, and I think in part because of that and some of the other interactions that we had with people who are in the pharmaceutical industry, we started looking at marijuana again. It was something that I had reported on before, written articles about, things like that, but we decided to give it a fresher look. There was some research that was coming out specifically out of Israel that we thought was pretty compelling, so that sort of got the ball rolling.
Now, you had an opinion
Yeah.
before you started this documentary about the use of medical marijuana. What was that?
Yeah, I didn't find it very compelling, the research on medical marijuana. I didn't find it very convincing. And this is really interesting. I'll see if I can explain this well. But if you were to look at a scientific topic and just say, I want to know what the literature sort of reflects on this topic, you can do this in lots of different ways. In science, there's something known as PubMed, for example. And PubMed is a pretty good, you can get either a 30,000-foot view or you can drill down into specific articles. And when you looked at that, when you looked at PubMed and you picked a time frame, say over the last 20, 30 years, and looked at cannabis, you found more than 90%, I think 94% we found of the articles about cannabis over that time were about side effects, adverse effects, harm. And it wasn't until we started looking outside of that that a different picture started to emerge.
So I think as journalists, it's very rarely the case that as a human being you don't have a point of view on things. That doesn't mean you can't be fair, and it doesn't mean, but there's a difference between having no opinion and having a fair and doing a fair assessment.
Yeah, I think that's right. With sciences, there's interpretations of data like anything else. Maybe less so, but you do get into situations where two scientists will look at the exact same paper, the exact same data, and reach very different conclusions.
So your premise going into this your thought was, there's not much science supporting the use of medical marijuana that would lead me to think this is a good idea.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That way, you know, it wasn't the first time we'd looked at this issue, and obviously there was, you know, decades of data. So in that sense, we had some idea of what we were likely to find. But this was all U.S. data. This was U.S. funded laboratories. Even if they weren't necessarily in this country, they were all U.S. funded projects, and that was the sort of picture that we were looking at initially.
So tell me how you start. Some of your producers are here this morning.
Yeah. How did we start?
Stand and be acknowledged. Yes, there's the team from CNN.
There were a couple of very interesting papers out of Israel that really, I think, sort of started the ball rolling, and they were big trials. They were looking at epilepsy as a whole, and it was pretty remarkable. They were trialing this as a medication in hospitals. So in the United States, you have a substance that is listed as a Schedule I substance.
Explain what that means.
That means it has no medicinal benefit and has high risk of abuse.
And surprisingly to me, it's ranked as a more dangerous drug than, say, cocaine.
Cocaine is a Schedule II drug. So in and of itself, that obviously raised a lot of flags for people. But when we started looking at the Israel data, you know, and really diving into it, it was well done. You know, these are well done studies, well controlled studies. They've been long-term studies. And we decided to go to Israel and visit the labs and talk to the scientific researchers ourselves.
Now pause there. You call your bosses and say, hey, we want to go to Israel and see that medical marijuana may actually be working. What do they say?
What did you say? It's one nice thing about, and you know, Cynthia, I mean, you know, for the most part, when we make the case, and I think there was a really important case here to be made, we get to go. You know, I think there's very few times when we haven't had a chance to be able to do that if you make the case. And the documentary wouldn't have been complete without being there. The other thing I'll just tell you that really started getting the ball rolling was we uncovered that the United States holds a patent on marijuana as a medical drug for neuroprotection. So the U.S. government holds a patent on medical marijuana while simultaneously saying it's a Schedule I substance. They have a patent saying it has medicinal benefit while saying it doesn't. And so that hypocrisy, that needed to be answered. And that was something else that we started really diving into.
You also discovered the reason that there was so much data in the U.S. saying that marijuana wasn't. Explain, this is fascinating because, as you say, you first look at the data, you're going, well, hold it a second. These studies overwhelmingly talk about problems, very few that support it. Why is that?
You know, that is a great question, and in some ways, marijuana, cannabis became a metaphor for, I think, a lot of the different ways we get information in this country, and the various competing pressures that have an influence on what information you're actually given. So with this particular situation, there's a lot of reasons people did not want. There was a lot of competition against marijuana as a substance. Everything from the nylon industry not wanting to compete against hemp, the pharmaceutical industry not wanting to compete against marijuana, and then this sort of social stigma that was taking place after Prohibition, where you needed literally to give something else to prohibit. And it was an interesting thing. They decided to focus on marijuana. There are literally these papers that say, okay, you know, Prohibition's been repealed, what is going to be our next thing? And marijuana was on the list. And there was all these other things as well with regard to even DuPont Chemical as a company.
Thanks for bringing that up.
I didn't bring that up during the speech last night, I'll just say. But DuPont Chemical was a company that focused on both pain medications and nylon. And so there was a lot of reasons for DuPont as a company not to be in favor of marijuana.
So you have a little bit of the intellectual underpinnings of the documentary. I want you to see, though, the very human face put on this documentary. Let's take a look at the clip and just give you a sense of the work that Sanjay and his team put together.
We've seen her flatline in the hospital. We've said goodbye.
You're listening to Matt and Paige Figge describe their own daughter. What would you do if this were your child? Charlotte Figge had an extreme form of epilepsy. Her body was so frail that any seizure could kill her. With no traditional treatment left to try and the clock ticking away, her parents decided to try marijuana. Charlotte was just 5 years old.
You need a card in order to be able to get the cannabis from a pharmacy. Doctors have to prescribe it.
You need 2 doctors in Colorado to get the card for a juvenile or a child. It was hard. We were the first young child, and they said no. Everyone said no, 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 no.
Certainly her age played a role in my hesitance.
Dr. Alan Shackelford is a Harvard-trained physician. He's also among a handful of doctors in Colorado who give prescriptions for medical marijuana. From the moment Charlotte entered his office, he knew she was in trouble. While he was just examining her, she had 2 seizures.
She'd failed everything. There were no more options for her. Everything had been tried, except cannabis.
Here's how scientists think it might work. Marijuana is made up of 2 main ingredients: THC, that's the psychoactive part that makes you high, and CBD, also called cannabidiol. It's the CBD that scientists think modulates electrical and chemical activity to help quiet the excessive activity in the brain that causes seizures.
I measured it with a syringe and squirted it under her tongue. It was exciting and very nerve-wracking.
Holding Charlotte in her arms, Paige waited. An hour ticked by, and then another, and then another.
She didn't have a seizure that day. And then she didn't have a seizure that night.
Did you sit there and look at your watch? And...
Right, I thought, this is crazy. And then she didn't have one the next day. And then the next day. And I thought, she would have had 100 by now.
In his compelling documentary, Weed.
You've looked at the evidence.
There is real science now out there.
He was flat out wrong about weed.
A year-long journey that changed what many of us thought about marijuana, myself included.
I think, we've been terribly and systematically misled.
We used to only picture this. Then we showed you this. Medical marijuana, treating seizures, pain, dozens of other ailments.
Charlotte's doing amazing, just better and better each month.
But we learned this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning.
I think we went from about 150 calls a month to over 4,000.
There are still so many issues to be addressed. The federal government says marijuana is among the most addictive drugs with no medicinal value. Many serious scientists say they're wrong.
It's a medicine.
It's the politics of pot, pitting policy against patients. Trapped in the middle, sick, qualified people who want medical marijuana but can't get it because it's illegal.
If you tried to go back to Ohio with Jordan's medication,
Will be arrested.
Wow. So that gives you a taste of the 2 hours. And I mean, part of this, part of the power of the documentary, I think, is that you explore without fear or favor, you go into every corner. You explore, listen, the decision to give pot to a 5-year-old is certainly the first time, was a big decision.
It was a big decision, and one of our producers, Melissa Dunst, who isn't here today, but she found the Figge family in Colorado, and I have children. I have a 9, 7, and 5-year-old myself, and the idea of giving a 5-year-old marijuana, to just even put it out there, and you have to assume, as you know, Cynthia, sometimes people aren't going to hear the whole story. They're just going to see that headline, and we wanted to be very careful in how we approach that particular part of it.
So how hard was it to talk the Figge family into letting you tell their story?
It was a real challenge, and part of it was, again, because they looked me up, and what they saw was that I wrote these articles that did not find medicinal marijuana to be very favorable, to be very beneficial. And so that was another, I think, barrier to sort of overcome with them. But I think in the end, in part because of Melissa, I flew out there, spent some time with them myself, talked about how we wanted to just approach this scientifically. I wanted to look at it truly scientifically. I wanted to look at it in the context of data that was now coming out around the world. And I also didn't want to get into the moral equivalence argument. Marijuana is better than XYZ. We had to get to the point where we were going to talk about something and let it stand on its own merit. and that was really important. And I think it was important to them. They're a very, very conservative family. They live in a part of Colorado where it's particularly conservative. Neither one of them had ever tried marijuana in their lives. Paige, the mother, the first time I was interviewing her about it, she couldn't even say the word. She was giggling as she said the word. It was she was so uncomfortable about it.
Dad was serving in Afghanistan.
Dad was serving in Afghanistan, and he's you can't help but think about him as in the father role. He's got this daughter who's having 300 seizures a week, and he's in Afghanistan. He's worried that these seizures or the medications that she's been given to treat the seizures would kill her. And so he's on the internet in his downtime over there, and he starts Googling any kind of therapy to try and treat his daughter. And he actually comes around to cannabis on the internet himself, and that starts a discussion between Matt and Paige, husband and wife. Never tried the stuff, never believed in it, wouldn't even talk about it. Then all of a sudden, here they are considering it as an option.
So how long did it take to put the entire two pieces together? 2 years?
2 years.
2 years. Fair to say, you were wrong.
Yeah, I think that we're going back to the other thing. Are we just talking in general? Because the answer to both may be yes. I don't know.
Well, listen. I mean, nobody likes to say they're wrong, but you said it very publicly and very loudly.
Yeah, it wasn't easy to do. Just from a human level, you don't like to do it, and again, you don't know how that's going to be taken, right? I needed to explain myself, but Cynthia, I think it became one of these things where what I started to see was not only were people benefiting from marijuana as a medicine, many times they were benefiting when nothing else worked. And
well, indeed, when the something else was actually harming them. I mean, whatever the range of these prescription narcotics were.
Yeah, no, look, this little girl, Charlotte Figge, had been on 7 different generations of anti-epileptics. And these drugs are powerful drugs. They knock you out. They were worried that they would stop her heart, they'd stop her breathing. The medications themselves were really tough on her. They wanted to get to the point where they wanted to compound a veterinary medication as the next step. And when they brought up the idea of using cannabis, everyone said, whoa, cannabis.
Right.
But we will give her horse medications. Yes.
Right?
It was remarkable to me. And then it worked. So you saw the clip. This is a girl who had 300 seizures a week. She's now mainstreamed in school. She's beautiful. And I went and met her last Christmas, and she took me by the hand and remembered me and introduced me to her friends, and it was delightful. And that's a girl who, if she leaves the state of Colorado, her family could be arrested for drug trafficking. It's amazing, and that's the. So we tried to stay very scientific in how we approached this documentary, but you could not escape the social hypocrisy. You could not escape the political hypocrisy. You could not escape the stigma that is surrounding the substance for seemingly no or at least not well-founded reasons.
The work changed the politics.
People, facts matter.
23 states now permit use of medical marijuana.
They do. Governor Chris Christie, who was absolutely against this, I mean, very publicly against this, changed his mind. And
from watching think about that, guys. When that's powerful.
Yeah, we'd like to take some credit for that. It's always hard to, but facts matter. And I think that's one of the things that I think people weren't, and myself included. That's part of the reason I was wrong. I didn't dive deep enough into that research. I dismissed patients as malingerers, and there are a lot of them out there. It's still a drug of abuse. People take that, they say they have medical problems. They don't. They're just trying to get high. That happens. That's a fact. But are you going to risk the idea that Charlotte Figge probably wouldn't be alive today because of that possible abuse? And that's a question that I'm not trying to answer, but that's the question people have to ask themselves. And I think that for me, it became almost a little bit of a moral mandate. How can you, it would be improper, as I said last night, improper or even immoral to somehow deny people treatment that could help them if not save them.
I have so many more questions, but I bet those of you in the audience have some too. But think about your questions. I'm going to call on you in just a sec, but let me ask you one question. Medical marijuana you support and believe has a scientific basis. What about the legalization of pot for recreational use?
I'm not, that interested in that recreational part of it. I don't. That does get a little bit into the moral equivalence question a bit. I don't, I've tried the stuff myself once. I didn't care for it that much. I think that people choose to have recreation in many different ways. That's their decision. I didn't want to commingle these two issues, though, because again, you wouldn't ask that question about ibuprofen, a chemotherapy drug, because it changes the perception of it. I'm talking about this as a medical drug. So as soon as you start commingling it, which I understand is a natural sort of thing, I think in some ways it cheapens it, and I think that we needed to again let this stand on its own merits. So I can talk about what are some of the facts around marijuana for people who use it recreationally, and there's lots of data on that sort of thing as well.
One thing everyone can agree on: it's not good for developing brains.
It's not good for developing brains. The developing brain, and by the way, our brains develop a lot longer than I think most people realize.
Until
mid-20s, probably.
Sorry, guys.
But it probably has more. Professor Gates is some of our brains are still developing, right?
Sorry, he's high.
That's right.
Skip. Okay. We could go on for a long time. Lisa's giving me the Cynthia, go to the audience look, aren't you? Yeah, I can see. Oh, we're going to start with Skip Gates. Yes. DuPont winner from last night. Yes. Professor, what would you like to say?
Well, I was curious, and I'm sure other people were. What are the effects on the little girl in terms of getting high? I don't know how. Yeah. No.
Well, interesting point, because she isn't.
No, she's not. And so cannabis is made up of two primary active ingredients. There's lots of ingredients, but THC, that gets you high, and then CBD. And CBD is not psychoactive. But CBD is the part of the plant they believe can help regulate the brain activity, so it can help treat the seizures. So she doesn't smoke it. She takes it as an oil. So it's an oil that's dripped underneath the tongue, and she's not high. She was functioning. She's going to school.
Because another incredible part of the documentary, which you just got a little flavor of, but if you haven't seen it, you didn't realize, is the growers. I mean, the fact that you got that family to talk about the growers.
They did not want to talk.
I wonder why.
They told me some incredible stories just even before we started filming. But these five brothers. First of all, they're ridiculously handsome brothers. It was unbelievable. I couldn't believe I meet these guys, and they're all just
clean cut.
Yeah, they're pre-made for TV, but there's a lot of people who very much dislike them. There are people who would literally try and run their cars off the road, and only one of them had anything to do with the marijuana industry prior to getting involved with medicinal marijuana. They all had they're all highly educated, they were in different facets of our society, but they really believed in this, and they believed that they were going to be able to help a lot of people. Eventually, it was similar to the Figgies. They had to go make the case, and again, I think besides...
But what they did was separate the two compounds so that you could extract the
scientifically, it's a challenging process. You're actually you have to create these hybrids of the plant to raise the concentration of whatever substance you want. So most marijuana is bred in this country to be high THC because that's what the recreational users want. But this was a high CBD, so you had to breed that, and that takes time. It takes some scientific talent to do as well.
So that's essentially the answer to Skip Gates' question. She's not taking marijuana that has because they've figured out how to do this.
Correct.
And they called it, you saw just a frame of it, they've called this Charlotte's Web.
Yeah, that's great.
Questions? Come on, journalism students. Yes, sir. Or project. Either way. She's so bossy. This is what producers are like. Yeah.
I'm just curious about you talk about isolating the CBD. and not also the psychoactive ingredient. So I'm just curious if there's been any talk about legislation that might legalize only the high CBD concentrated marijuana instead of marijuana where it's both the psychoactive, where maybe more of the negative health consequences maybe.
Yeah, no, there's been a fair amount of what they call CBD-only legislation, and it brings up a whole host of things. You isolate the CBD, but a lot of people talk about synthesizing the CBD as well. Now, one thing I will say is that if you look at the science carefully on this, you come to realize that having small amounts of THC, not enough that would make anybody high or euphoric or whatever, is probably still necessary because it helps transport the CBD throughout the body. And so simply synthesizing a single compound may not work very well. They've tried to synthesize single parts of the marijuana plant in the past, and it hasn't worked as well. And that may be true for many of the drugs in our society. You know, we find these medications in nature, and then we, in part because need to mass produce them and profit off of them, we usually try and figure out a way to synthesize single molecules. And we find that almost never does it work as well as the whole natural occurring product itself. It could be because there's other micro amounts of compounds that help it get absorbed in the body. So that's coming up now in the legislation. Do you do CBD only legislation, or do you do high CBD strains? And those are two very different things.
Another question. Yes.
Hi. You mentioned that part of the reason why you changed your mind was because you hadn't really looked at all the facts, but it also seemed like, have you encountered that the scientific community, especially here in the US, was also kind of putting out more studies that were focused towards the negative stuff, as opposed, so you couldn't actually find the facts even if you were looking for them?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. If you look at the scientific literature, and even if you looked over a few decades, you'd see a much higher preponderance of these negative studies. But to answer your question a little bit more fully, in order to get a study funded in this country on cannabis, you'd have to get FDA approval, you'd have to get NIH approval, and the final thing was an organization known as NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse. They were the ones who'd give the final okay and also provide the marijuana for study, because you had to use their substance in order to actually get the FDA funding. And NIDA, their mandate is to study drug abuse. Right. And they're the ones giving the final approval. So when you realize that 9 out of 10 studies looked at abuse, you could sort of see why.
The documentary also took you to Mississippi. It is just so fulsome. This was tell us about Mississippi's role.
This is so unusual, but in the middle of Ole Miss, Oxford, Mississippi, is where the only federally funded marijuana grow field exists in the United States. Why they picked the middle of a college campus, I don't know.
But those of you who have younger siblings and are thinking of college, no. Yes, next question.
I was wondering, how do you walk as a piece of journalism, how do you walk the line between informative journalism and advocacy journalism, especially when there's the medical and recreational sides of the argument, especially for marijuana, and how do you feel about kind of being embraced by perhaps maybe the recreational side when you say you're focused only on the medical side?
Do you consider this a piece of advocacy journalism?
I don't. And frankly, you shouldn't give me a DuPont for a piece of advocacy journalism. You should take it away if that's what people think. But the reality is that it's a really good question. And this is a metaphor, I think. I mean, this is one issue, but I think this could come up in just about anything. People will glom on to your journalism. You guys will all find, and people will use your works of journalism to advance their own agendas. And sometimes it makes a lot of sense because it's very much in line with what you reported, but sometimes it's because they're using it to advance something that's not quite what you said, but they selectively take things and use them. So I don't know how you get around that, but we did not go out to set a piece of advocacy journalism. We wanted to be very scientifically based, but what you described absolutely happens. There's no question.
I just add to this, Howard Stringer, at one point, the president of CBS News, said to me once, Cynthia, beware the myth of even-handedness. Going out and finding 3 people who think I'm a jerk and 3 people who think I'm fantastic does not necessarily lead to the truth.
Yeah.
That the truth is something else. And I think that it's something, you know, you have to struggle with and is very contextual, but I think that there is a, you know, getting to the facts may lead to a conclusion. You know, look at Edward R. Murrow in the McCarthy documentary. I mean, it's a clear conclusion at the end. That does not mean that it isn't factual and powerful and truthful. Yes.
Yeah, and that's such an important point, Cynthia. I mean, I you know, and I think it's maybe not as intuitive as people think. There's this idea of two sides. You see it on television all the time. You're going to get one side.
We vomit it
the
up
other
there.
side.
Here's one side, the other side. Now you have the truth. Not necessarily.
And people say that's fairness. The problem is that if you're giving a side that is wrong the equal time, you're making them seem equivalent, and they're not. There can be a right and a wrong side, and I think, you know, sometimes it has to be said.
I think so too. Yes.
Dr. Gupta, thank you very much for being here. One of the things I so much appreciated about the documentary was the scientific method. So you sort of swept away all of the non-scientific assessment of marijuana, and you drilled it down to pharmacology, pharmacokinetics, what is the actual benefit to patients. The other thread for me in the documentary is that this is kind of a global health story, in that you have these changing worlds in medicine now. I didn't see the State of the Union address yet from last night, but I'm wondering, well, what is the NIH funding budget going to be next year? And as the research funding, you know, in the United States continues to decrease, what does that mean to other countries? For example, Israel has an incredibly well-developed healthcare system. The Gulf countries are sort of coming on board. And so you have these other threads coming into play. And one of the ideas that came to my mind is that you did a beautiful job of bridging medicine and media, where, you know, maybe there is this gap. One of the stories in New York this fall was about Dr. Chris Christie in terms of his decision-making with Ebola. And so from your documentary, you were able to create change at a political level in a very short period of time. Yet I wonder what your thinking is in terms of the medical community. Has the medical community failed somewhat? Because first of all, they failed to advocate on the basis of research for marijuana, but have they also failed to, you know, in one sort of fell swoop, Dr. Chris Christie was able to bowl over the heads of the CDC, the NIH, the New England Journal of Medicine. So what, has the medical community sort of not taken that gap? And also journalism. Why did we journalists fail to hold accountable Chris Christie with regards to his management of, say, for example, Ebola?
Okay. What do you say?
Well,
that's a biggie.
Yeah, I mean, the medical community moves slowly on these things, and part of it is because there's you know, there aren't people who are just solely focused on the use of cannabis as, I think, as a medication, and there's still, I think, a conservatism around the culture. So even now, while you have, you know, lots of experts, people who are publishing in peer-reviewed journals more than ever, right, there's still a stigma around, I think, marijuana. But the Chris Christie question that you asked at the end, I mean, I think you get these inflection points all of a sudden where and with regard to Ebola, where he you know, because of a lot of different forces coming together at the same time, was able to create that change quickly. And I think I think as opposed to sort of incremental changes in marijuana that we're seeing now, 23 states, District of Columbia, I think at some point there's going to be a sea change on this issue. Politically, it's sort of a non-winner. Nobody's going to campaign on this issue and win an election. But I think it's got enough air cover now where I think people, you know, will be willing to embrace it because of the hundreds and thousands of patients like Charlotte Figge.
Lisa's going to let us have these last 3 questions. I can see. Yes, Lisa, the last questions. Sir.
Good morning. For all that your work here has accomplished in raising public awareness on this issue, how do you weigh that against the federal public policy needs that you've spoken about that could have been accomplished if you were leading the Surgeon General's office?
Oh, well, great question.
I like how you sort of back-ended into that. That was good.
Well, and actually, and it's part of the question I meant to ask you, which is, are you a journalist first or a doctor first? So perfect setup.
Well, Let me answer that in two ways. First of all, I think you may be giving the Surgeon General's office a little bit more credit than it deserves. I know the Surgeon General's office could single-handedly, or frankly any health office, could have single-handedly changed the legislation that's been on the books since 1972 around marijuana. And there's lots of different things wrapped into that. You'd have to reschedule it, you'd have to increase funding for research, you'd have to grow more of it for those studies. There's many layers to changing that. You still need data. You need US-funded data to get an FDA approval. That has to come from somewhere. So, and that's not just the Surgeon General's office. Having said that, that was a tough decision, not taking that job. I mean, I've worked in public service before. For me, it was a tough decision. One thing I did not realize as I started to go through that process of Surgeon General was that you cannot practice surgery anymore as Surgeon General. Go figure. And I wanted to still be able to practice. It's a big part of my life. Most of the other Surgeons General who were surgeons had been much older, either retired from their practice or left their practices already. So it just wasn't the right time for me.
It wasn't your love of journalism that kept you as a journalist?
I loved it. It was a tough decision for lots of different reasons. I do think we journalists can have a huge impact. And I think there's no question about that. And if that's your goal, it's a good field. It's a great field to be in.
So you once famously tweeted that you were a doctor first.
I'm a doctor first. Medicine was my first love. I still love the idea of it's so tangible. You wake up in the morning, I kind of know when I operate every Monday. Ronnie Selig over here always sends me a nice email in the morning, a Monday morning OR message, she calls it, and it's just it's very concrete for me. It's very tangible. It's very project oriented. I'm going to go in, I'm going to do this, and hopefully somebody's going to be better because of it, and that's nice. But and journalism can accomplish the same thing, I think, but in different ways. It's broader. It may take more time to get there, but you can have a lot of impact.
So just to put a fine point on it, you can be more powerful as a journalist at CNN than you could be as Attorney General. As Attorney General, we don't know. As Surgeon General.
I don't know. The thing is, like most things in life, it's kind of what you put into it.
Yes or no?
But it's what you put. There are journalists out there that are obviously very powerful, and surgeons. I mean, most people couldn't name the Surgeon General, but it's not to say that there haven't been Surgeons General in the past.
They could if it was you. Anyway, thank you. I won't badge you any further. Although if there weren't all these people here, I certainly would. Go right ahead.
All right, thanks, Lisa. Anyway, but Lucia Hoffman, I am a MS student here, and congratulations last night. Cynthia did a great job, and on a personal level, Doctor, how rewarding it is for you, like to do what you do and make such a difference, in people's lives. And another question, like about Twitter, how important is social media nowadays for your line of work?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's profoundly important and gratifying to have impact. Charlotte, that little girl, she's emblematic of thousands of other patients, but that was really powerful for us to be a part of that. We didn't cause it; they were already pursuing this, but to be able to tell that story and have other people potentially benefit it's a great line of work. It really just is. And if you remember that part of it, it stays great. And so don't forget that part of it. Social media is very important. We use it all the time. I love the immediacy of it. Covered the earthquake in Haiti, for example, 5 years ago now. And I remember I was on Twitter all the time, and I was getting story leads all the time, and I was also at times only able to tweet out because we didn't have any power, we didn't have any way of getting our messages out other than, literally sitting there with my iPhone and taking pictures and tweeting it out to show people what had happened there. So it's I'm 45 years old. I don't know, if this is going to be a generational thing in terms of the different social medias out there, but I like it, and I use it quite a bit.
Thank you. Next and final question.
Hi, I'm from California, so medical marijuana is legal. The issue that's always intrigued me are people with medical marijuana cards that work federal jobs. It becomes a thing, health versus employment risk. And disregarding those who don't really need a medical card in California, the ones that really, on a day-to-day basis, work, it makes it very difficult for them to get through the day with pain. And I feel like that's an issue in our state where there's federal workers hiding legal cards. And I'm wondering, in your experience, what would your advice be? Do they choose health or do they choose job security?
It sounds like, do you have a personal anecdote around this? Do you know somebody who's dealing with this?
Yeah, but they'd probably prefer I don't say it.
Well, that's part of the problem. I mean,
I bet Sanjay could go do an interview with them.
Yeah.
And that would be good. Right?
Well, yeah. My name is Bianca Hawk.
Okay, all right.
H-O-C-K, not like Tony Hawk.
The producers are writing that down right now.
I choose health. I don't. It's how do you put yourself in those shoes? I mean, you probably need the job, you need the money. I mean, it's a ridiculous position to be in. And you said it well. There are people who definitely abuse this, and I think the assumption is by a lot of people, including myself, for a period of time, was that these are mainly, or predominantly, or maybe even all people who are just trying to get high and using the medical marijuana card as an excuse. And there are definitely those people out there. But there are people who, sounds like you're describing, who have very legitimate pain for whom other things don't work. And this can be a very effective pain medication. That's a little bit, when I say it's been incremental, it's this. And it's this dichotomy between the state and the federal government. It's happening in California, it's happening in Colorado, it's happening in Washington State. We're seeing that. I think at some point there's going to be a big, broad shift. And it's going to have to come at the federal level, because otherwise these types of really ridiculous situations are going to keep happening. So let's talk afterward.
Thank you very much. On a final note, I just want you to share with the audience, you said last night, you just said you were 45 years old. The first people you called when you got the notification that you had won the DuPont Award were?
My parents. You got to call your parents.
And they said?
My mom was very excited. My dad didn't believe me. That's how it goes. But even after 45 years, you still want praise of parents. That's
Thank you so much, Dr. Sanjay Gupta.